government struggles with significant fiscal strains, Moody's investor service has further downgraded Nigeria's credit rating. The credit rating agency anticipates that Nigeria's fiscal and debt condition will continue to deteriorate as far as what their forecasts are concerned. Now, the agency has downgraded the rating from its previous B3 to CAA1, which is pretty much junk territory, further putting the country in non-investment grade as the capacity of the country to weather the economic storms, continues to be eroded by ingrained institutional vulnerabilities and social issues. Joining us to discuss further, Professor Nnanna, who of course is the chief economist at the Development Bank of Nigeria. He joins us from our Abuja studios. Professor, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with the downgrade. Is Moody's being alarmist here, or are these fiscal concerns for Nigeria very real?
Hi, good morning, Rodas. Well, the question is actually timely because, Moody's, they will issue this rating based on their perception of what is to come and what has already occurred. And just looking at the Nigerian fiscal budget for 2023, it tells you everything you need to know. The level of debt servicing is over 75 or 70% thereabout of the budget. And as a result of that, the revenue generation is challenged because, as we know, the oil situation in Nigeria is a bit challenged. There's a bit of fuel scarcity right now. And of course, the government has put out a statement regarding what the issues are and what they're trying to do to resolve it. Notwithstanding, Moody's has already seen, based on everything they know from a macroeconomic landscape, dimensioning the political risk as well as country risk and operational risk within the economy. And consequently, they have come out with this report to demonstrate that, hey, investors will be less susceptible to come into Nigeria for the obvious reasons of the uncertainty around the fiscal constraints of the government's ability to repay the debt. But beyond the debt repayment, let's look at the political scene, for example. We know they might be, part of the report said there's a possibility of civic or social unrest after the post-election, and that is a pause for concern because that is a signaling effect to the international community, including investors who may be engaged in discussions right now in coming to Nigeria. So I wouldn't say they're alarmists per se, but quite frankly, they are quite concerned and they're more or less risk averse to Nigeria's situation. But that doesn't mean there aren't still opportunities in the country. As we all know, within the country, whether we're in a recession or not, there's still money to be made. Profits can still be derived in several sectors, albeit that the Moody's have already downgraded to, as you've already alluded to, near junk status.
So what's the fallout then, as far as, because I think you wrote a post about this on your LinkedIn account where you reacted, you were one of the first people to react to this over the weekend when this came out. So what's the fallout from the downgrade?
So looking at the international economics as what should happen. So typically when a rating agency downgrades a country, they look at the social, they look at the political, the country operational risks involved, then make their report known to everyone. So as a result of that, what that translates to is a higher interest rate to every participant, so meaning that interest rates will go up if you want to borrow money from the international or raise capital from the international market. So that's the immediate knee-jerk reaction. And for a government like Nigeria, who is trying to finance its budget, we have a budget deficit currently right now. So to finance or plug the gap, we'll have to raise money locally and internationally. So it will mean we'll be challenged to raise it internationally. FDI inflows will suddenly dry up or slow down a bit, then ultimately what I see happening would be the debt management office will basically have to attract market participants to essentially buy bonds at enticing enough rate to essentially ensure we plug the gap in our budget. Notwithstanding, right now, institutions globally are looking at Nigeria, investors globally are looking at Nigeria and trying to see the lay of the land. I think we'll know more after the election because that is really the fulcrum. That is what's everyone's waiting for. Once we know, so when we have some visibility who the next president is going to be and the policies that are going to come down, then we're able to have some visibility as the year progresses. But right now, I think most investors will probably take a wait and see approach to see what happens and ultimately come back to Nigeria because in the end, as I've earlier said, even though you have rating agencies downgrading us, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no profit to be derived in this country. So there are many sectors that are still going to grow, but it's just a perception, really, a signaling effect, which the Moody's ratings agency has done. And I suspect willing participants who care and want to derive profits in Nigeria, they will still invest, albeit at a lowered or a much significantly reduced pace.
All right, great. And I have a two-pronged question for you, Professor. And if you help us just to remind us how this works. How is the Development Bank of Nigeria funded? Is it from the government or is it from multilateral agencies?
Okay, so the Development Bank of Nigeria is funded by international partners and the federal government. So we have equity from the federal government, Ministry of Finance Incorporated, as well as Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, that's the NSIA, as well as African Development Bank, who have provided some equity, and let's not forget European Investment Bank. All these are equity shareholders of the organization. On the debt side, we have the World Bank, we have the AFD, or the French Development Bank, KfW, that's the German Development Bank. So these, and also African Development Bank too, provided some level of debt for the bank to operate. Keep in mind now, the core objective here is to finance micro, small, and medium enterprises at a fully market-conforming basis, and this is through intermediary banks, that is participating financial institutions, which implies that commercial banks, microfinance banks, merchant banks, and other financial institutions can come to the DBN window to take some funds for onward lending to MSMEs. So that's broadly how our structure is and what our mandate is, to be honest, at this point.
Okay, great. So so if I tie that back to the downgrade, does that impact your fundraising in any way at all?
Well, we are a development bank, so our core objective really is around impact. We want to see impact in the MSME landscape. We're sector agnostic, which implies that we don't really care what sector you play in, provided you're classified as an MSMEs, but we really want to ensure that the MSMEs within the country have adequate financing and the skills required to use those funds to grow their respective businesses. Now, what this means as a relation to the Moody's downgrade would mean that on average, companies, private as well as public enterprises will have to go into right now. You have private organizations that raise capital on the international market. You have commercial banks that raise capital on the international market. With this downgrade, it means that if they're still able to raise the capital, it will be at a higher interest rate, which will imply that that interest rate spread will have to be passed on to customers who are willing to take those loans, and so on. And ultimately, it gets passed down to households and MSMEs who are in the market, consumers who will be buying these goods and services at a much higher rate. Because if interest rates gotten from outside, we will input that and compute that in the cost of doing business within Nigeria and ultimately pass it down, at least part of it, to the final beneficiaries or the consumers. That's basically the flow of pattern here. But we're a development bank, so our objective is to raise capital to continue to finance MSMEs. Would it make it harder for us to raise money? Yes and no. I say that because since we're a DFI and our mandate is for development impact, and since we care about that, I suspect, and I know this to be true, our rates will be higher, but not as high as a commercial bank or a commercial enterprise, if you will. So we have a development mandate, so we can get some discounts from that off the international market, but ultimately we are still a commercial enterprise to the extent that we need to be financially sustainable. And to achieve this, we have to ensure that the monies we give out can be recouped back through our PFIs at a financially sustainable rate. So that's where we are. So it's a yes and no response I have to give you, Rodas.
All right, Professor Nnanna, I want to take a quick break. I have to ask you about fuel subsidies and how they're impacting the MSMEs that the Development Bank is focused on. So do stay tuned. We'll be right back with this conversation with the Chief Economist of the Development Bank of Nigeria on the Global Business Report here on Arise News. Welcome back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. We continue our conversation with Professor Joseph Nnanna, who is the Chief Economist of the Development Bank of Nigeria in our Abuja studios. Professor, thank you so much for sticking around. So before we went to break, you were talking about what the Development Bank's focus is, MSMEs. So I want to ask you about, what other things making news, the fuel subsidies, which are very much a part of the fiscal issues facing Nigeria. The DPRA, the Midstream Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, put out a press release, I think it was released on Friday or so, saying in particular that the current distribution hitch, here it is on the screen, is heightened by activities of cross-border smugglers who divert PMS meant for the Nigerian market to neighboring countries where the prices are significantly higher than Nigeria's regulated price. They then said they're engaging the customs service to address the issue. So, Professor, is the answer on what to do staring us in the face in this press release? And is this an example of when, politics overwhelms economic policy?
That's a fantastic analysis, Rodas, because it's axiomatic, meaning self-evident. I'm surprised that it's only coming to the fore that smugglers are from neighboring countries are coming in to take away the diesel and petrol and take it to their respective jurisdictions and sell there for a higher markup. It's business sense for them, but it showcases that our border patrol needs to be beefed up to prevent these things from occurring. But the larger question is the subsidy that's on ground right now. We cannot subsidize what we cannot afford. So look at it this way. In the US, subsidies in agriculture space occurs. I'm aware that agriculture players, farmers specifically, are paid in a way not to produce above a certain threshold in the US. That's subsidy, and that's managed because they have estimated a surplus from this part of the economy or this sector of the economy. So it's in Nigeria, the reverse is the case, where we're subsidizing in a deficit environment. So we don't have the money to subsidize, but we're still subsidizing to support everyone in the economy. And numerous reports from the World Bank and so on have come out and said, hey, the subsidies in question is actually benefiting the rich as opposed to the poor. So of what value, of what benefit is this to the overall populace? So for me, I think the answer is, as you rightly pointed out, is staring us in the face. The next president, if not this president, should truly consider removing subsidy in a structured and systematic way. Two, and more importantly, our border should be beefed up to prevent these types of miscreants, if you will, to be committing theft from our country, because that's how I see it. Because if the border patrols is allowing people to pass through, then it's wrong, because they're getting the benefit on the other side. But ultimately, the subsidy in question, if other neighboring countries are selling at a higher price, perhaps the writing is on the wall. Maybe we need to inch up our pricing too, to discourage them from coming in to benefit from our lower prices. Because truth be told, as a country, we cannot afford these prices at this level.
Thanks for that. So the logic behind the fuel subsidies has always been that they protect the poor. As far as poverty is concerned, how much of your outlook at the Development Bank for this year is concerned with poverty and alleviating it through your various programs?
Oh, that's a very good question, and I'm happy to speak on this a little bit more. So the Development Bank of Nigeria, we keep a keen eye of what's happening in the economy from the MSME lens, because this subsector is in fact the engine of economic growth. And to be sure, when we look at the MSMEs and what we're focused on right now is to ensure that the parts of the country that are a bit challenged or financially excluded, whether it's due to banditry or, if you like, pipeline vandalism or even insurgencies in the north. We are focused in those areas to build the capacity of them to utilize funds. So we're looking at capacity building in these focused regions, as well as finding willing participating financial institutions to channel funds to the businesses that are there so they can, whether it's working capital, product finance, or what have you, so they can go back to work and rebuild their respective communities. So we're really focused on that, especially this year, even though we have been year on year, but this year in particular, we want to ensure that the folks in those jurisdictions feel the presence of the bank's activities, whether it's from a technical perspective of leadership and leading in terms of capacity building and showing them how to use funds better, keeping record keeping and so on, or if you have the skills already, how can we entice the commercial banks, microfinance banks, and other financial institutions in those jurisdictions to look for the appropriate clients or customers there to channel funds to. That right there is the crux of this year's mandate, and the DBN is really focused on doing that this year to ensure that there's a even distribution, as we can see, a spread for the funds we disperse to our PFIs. So we really care about that because if you look at the misery index in the country, it is high. The Gini coefficient, meaning the gap between the income inequality of the rich and the poor, it's still getting wider and wider. And finally, if you look at the NBS's report last year on the poverty report, the multidimensional poverty index report, essentially is what the report states. And essentially the report spoke to the fact that 130 million Nigerians, or 60% or more Nigerians, are actually in one way, shape, or form impoverished, whether it's from lack of access to finance, lack of access to basic infrastructure, from healthcare to education or schools, to finally, if you will, basic infrastructure like shelter or water access and so on. So these are the different variables in which the NBS put out a very robust report last year, which in my view is very instructive to what we do in the bank and very instructive to the policy at play right now. So the right idea is for every DFI, not just the Development Bank of Nigeria, every DFI to look for ways to ensure that adequate financing, adequate care, adequate focus is geared to those disadvantaged or, if you will, financially excluded parts of the country, which I believe we are focused on and we have been focused on since inception. But this year, because we've seen all kinds of reports come out as to the varying degree of financial exclusion, we feel now is the time to double down and ensure that we actually hit the ball, get the ball rolling and hit the nail on the head.
All right, so I want to marry that with your economic forecast for the year, and I've only got about a minute or two to go. So briefly, if you can, we've got forecasts from the federal government, I think 3.75%. The IMF is 2.9%, and I think the World Bank is 3%. No, the IMF is 3%, the World Bank's 2.9%. So what's your forecast? What do you make of these varying forecasts for growth this year for GDP?
Let me just start by saying the DBN's forecast is closer to the World Bank's forecast. We forecast 2.85, maximum 3%, but we see it at that sweet spot in terms of GDP growth. So we're closer to the World Bank than we are the IMF or the federal government. The federal government is very ambitious, but you know, the fiscal pressures is really the challenge. And what we've seen right now from a global perspective is a rebalancing. Countries with positive current account surpluses are looking inwards to grow, while negative or deficit current accounts are looking outward to grow. That's what's happening globally right now. So for Nigeria, we have a positive current account in a way. So we are going to look inwards to grow. So focus should be on propping up some sectors that have promise. ICT, some level of trade because of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But let's not forget the payment systems too, where PAPS has come on board to take a single currency for trade. That's always a welcome in the sector. But overall, our forecast is 2.8, 2.9% growth for the year, and inflation will probably be still high double digits, but it will come down a bit after the election period subsides. So we're looking at around 17, 18% thereabout.
All right, Professor, we really appreciate you joining us to discuss the economic outlook for the country. We had so much more to discuss, but there's just never enough time. But we do appreciate you joining us, the Chief Economist for the Development Bank of Nigeria, Professor Joseph Nnanna. Thank you so much for talking to us. Really appreciate it.